What would you do if a woman draped in privilege stole your seat on a plane, then the entire cabin turned silent when they realized who you really were? Julian Carter boarded Flight 3921 with quiet confidence. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, carrying a sleek black briefcase, he looked every bit the seasoned traveler. There was no fanfare, no assistant trailing behind him, no first-class lounge photos, just a man moving with precision, ready for a routine flight. But beneath that composed exterior was the CEO of Vanguard Aerothy, very airline operating the flight. Julian had built his success on humility. He didn't believe respect had to be demanded, it should be given freely. And today, like every day, he chose to travel without entourage, without privilege. Just a boarding pass, a seat assignment, and a destination. The first-class cabin was nearly full when he entered. Soft lighting bathed the space in warmth. Leather seats gleamed. Passengers sipped champagne. Flight attendants offered practiced smiles. Everything seemed as expected, until he reached his seat. Row 1, Seat E. Someone was already there. Or rather, someone had claimed both Seat E and the one beside it, draped in a lavender blanket that stretched across the seats like a royal decree. A woman in her early 50s, manicured to perfection, with designer sunglasses still perched atop her head, reclined leisurely with a satisfied smile. Julian paused politely. "Excuse me, this is my seat," he said calmly, holding up his boarding pass. The woman didn't look up. She tightened her blanket and gave a half-hearted chuckle. "I'm using this row to sleep," she replied sharply, waving her hand as if shooing away a fly. Then with a smirk, "Surely you can find somewhere else if you even have a ticket." The words were icy. Not just dismissive, but deliberately cruel. Her voice was loud enough to be heard by nearby passengers. A few heads turned. Some phones subtly tilted upward. Julian didn't flinch. He simply stood, boarding pass still in hand. "This is seat 1E, he repeated, "and it belongs to me." Now the woman looked up, her eyes narrowing. She gave him a once-over, the kind that assesses someone not by who they are, but by who they appear to be. "You must be mistaken," she hissed. "People like me need space. You'll have to find something farther back." There it was. Not just arrogance, but entitlement, wrapped in layers of social class and coded language. Julian didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. But his stillness, his unshaken stance, seemed to shift the air in the cabin. Around them, silence stretched like static. The tension was palpable. A first-class showdown was unfolding, and no one quite knew what to do. A flight attendant, young and unsure, approached. Her name tag read Amber. "Ma'am," she said gently, "we really do need to stick to assigned seating." But the woman, Victoria Hensley, was unmoved. "I've explained that I have a medical condition," she said curtly. "This is my space for the next 5 hours." Julian looked at her. Not with anger, not even with frustration, just clarity. The kind of look that said, "I've seen this before, and I won't let it pass." "My ticket is for seat 1E, he said again, voice steady, barely above a whisper. "I intend to sit here." Victoria's lip curled. "You're asking me to move because of you?" she scoffed. "People like me are used to a certain standard. I'm not leaving." It wasn't about a seat anymore. This was about power, dignity, pride, and a quiet refusal to be dismissed. The cabin watched in silence. Some passengers looked away, uncomfortable. Others couldn't look away. Phones remained discreetly lifted. Social media was already buzzing. But no one expected what would happen next. Julian took a slow breath, then did something unexpected. He stepped back and said simply, "Then we wait." Amber blinked. "Sir?" "I'm not going to force anyone," Julian said calmly, "but I won't move either. Let's give it time." The clock began ticking. Minutes passed, 7 to be exact. Passengers shifted in their seats. Some whispered, some filmed. Victoria reclined deeper, fluffed her pillow, and tightened her blanket. But something had changed. The attention that once orbited around Victoria, the queen of the cabin, was shifting. Now it lingered on Julian, on his stillness, his refusal to engage in theatrics, his quiet insistence on being treated with respect. Then, a murmur spread. "Isn't that Julian Carter?" someone whispered from seat 2A. Another turned. "You mean the CEO?" The words floated through the air like wildfire. Eyebrows raised. Phones clicked. Recognition dawned on faces like light through fog. Victoria sat up a little straighter, suddenly aware of the change in atmosphere. She reached for her phone, but the signal was gone, no Wi-Fi. "No service." She turned to Amber. "Why isn't the Wi-Fi working?" Amber, now slightly firmer in tone, replied, "We're experiencing intermittent disruptions, ma'am." Behind them, Julian's phone buzzed quietly in his pocket. A secure message appeared on the screen. "Protocol Raven. Activated." He smiled faintly. A quiet storm had begun. The atmosphere in first class had shifted. Victoria Hensley sat upright now, the smugness in her smile beginning to erode. Her lavender blanket still stretched across two seats like a flag of conquest. But the murmurs, the stares, the sudden attention, one of it, was going her way anymore. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She was used to people backing down. Flight attendants who apologized, passengers who yielded, strangers who assumed she belonged because she always acted like she did. But Julian Carter wasn't moving, and now everyone was watching. Across the aisle, a middle-aged couple exchanged glances. In row 2, a younger woman angled her phone ever so slightly to capture the scene. Even the silence felt loud, pulsing with a question everyone was asking, but no one dared to speak aloud. Who exactly was this man? Amber, the young flight attendant, stood awkwardly between them. This wasn't part of her training. She'd been taught to handle seat disputes, sure, but nothing like this. Nothing that felt like a slow-burning fire about to catch the curtains. She looked to the purser, Grant Harrison, a tall, composed man in his late 40s with a headset clipped neatly behind his ear. Grant had worked with the airline for over 2 decades. He knew when to intervene and when to let a moment play out. He approached quietly, his voice calm. "Is there a problem here?" Amber started to answer, but Victoria cut in first. "I've explained," she said tightly. "I have a condition. I need space." "He," she pointed at Julian, "is escalating a situation that should have been handled discreetly." Grant looked at Julian. Their eyes met. Something passed between the mutual understanding. "Recognition? Respect?" "Sir?" Grant asked gently. Julian simply held up his boarding pass again. "Seat 1E, he said. Grant nodded. He already knew. He'd seen the manifest, but he also knew how delicate perception was in first class. You don't just resolve a dispute, you orchestrate one. Still, there was something in the way Julian stood. Silent, calm, unshaken. It wasn't pride, it was principle. Victoria scoffed loudly. Honestly, the entitlement some people have, that did it. A man in 2A, mid-60s, with a weathered baseball cap and a slight southern drawl, leaned forward. "Entitlement," he said, not loudly, but clearly. "Ma'am, he's not the one taking up 2 seats and refusing to budge." The tension cracked. Several passengers turned their heads. Someone snorted. Even Amber blinked. Victoria's face flushed. She looked around, suddenly feeling surrounded. "This is absurd," she snapped. "I've flown this route a dozen times. Never had a problem." This man is making a scene over a seat. But her voice had lost its authority. Her words, once sharp like arrows, now fell like dull paper. Julian still hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. Back in the operations center, miles away from the cabin drama, a quiet alert pinged across Vanguard Aero's internal system. Protocol Raven was live. Flight delays were being triggered. Maintenance windows had been paused. Schedules were being flagged for executive override. It wasn't about causing chaos. It was about drawing attention from the right people, from those who needed to see what happened when everyday dignity was ignored. On the plane, Victoria was unraveling. Her phone showed no service. Wi-Fi was down. Her calls to speak with the supervisor went nowhere. The cabin door had been closed for boarding, but takeoff was still delayed. Passengers whispered, "Why aren't we moving? What's happening? It's that woman in row 1. One voice cut through, "Isn't that the CEO?" The realization spread again, this time louder. Amber stood a little taller. She had a different kind of respect in her eyes now, not for Victoria, but for the man standing silently, never once losing his composure. She leaned toward Grant and whispered, "Should we tell her?" Grant shook his head. "Not yet." In seat 3F, a young boy tugged his mother's sleeve. "Mom, is that the guy from the video?" His mom checked her phone, tried refreshing, but the signal was gone. Still, she recognized the man too. Julian Carter. The billionaire no one ever saw shouting. The one who always flew without bodyguards. The one whose silence had more weight than a dozen speeches. The man who was now being told by a stranger in first class that he didn't belong. Victoria crossed her arms tightly. "I'll call legal when we land," she muttered to herself. Julian finally spoke. "I'm not interested in punishment," he said softly. "Only fairness." It was a sentence that landed heavier than any insult. "I didn't ask you to move because of who I am," he continued. "But you refused to move because of who you thought I was." That sentence didn't just hang in the air. It pierced it. Passengers looked at each other. The man in 2A nodded slowly. The woman beside him mouthed, "Wow." Grant glanced at his watch, then tapped his headset. A quiet directive was issued. Moments later, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to an unexpected seating issue, we'll be pausing departure briefly. We appreciate your patience and understanding." Victoria sat bolt upright. "This is ridiculous. Are we really holding up the entire flight for this?" Julian sat down. Gracefully, calmly, as if returning to his rightful place. The seat beside him remained empty but not silent. It spoke volumes. Victoria reached for the call button. But Amber was already beside her, with Grant close behind. "Ma'am," Grant said gently but firmly, "please remain seated." "You can't be serious," she snapped. Julian didn't look at her. He was looking out the window, watching the sun begin to dip behind distant clouds. He didn't need to win the argument. He'd already changed the conversation. Julian Carter didn't say another word. He didn't need to. While Victoria Hensley fumed in seat 1F, clinging to her lavender blanket and flickering sense of superiority, Julian remained motionless. Calm. Steady. The storm swirling around him never once touched the quiet at his core. And in that stillness, the real shift began. He hadn't made threats. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't demanded special treatment, even though as passengers were slowly realizing he had every right to. Because Julian Carter wasn't just a first-class passenger. He was the CEO of Vanguard Aero, the very airline they were sitting on. But he hadn't announced that. He hadn't pulled rank or called the cockpit. Instead, he had chosen to let the moment breathe, to allow everyone around him to decide what kind of world they wanted to be part of. And the world was watching. Phones were still out. Wi-Fi was still mysteriously down. Some passengers had tried switching to cellular, but found nothing but dead air. The silence grew heavier, more reflective. Passengers were talking, but now they were talking to each other. "She just assumed he didn't belong here," one woman murmured to her husband. "Yeah," the man replied, shaking his head. "Didn't even ask his name." In row 4, a father leaned over to his teenage son. "That right there," he said, gesturing toward Julian. That's how you hold your ground without losing your soul. His son nodded slowly, watching the man in the navy suit, who still hadn't looked away from the window. Julian's profile was sharp, thoughtful. The kind of face people remembered not because it was famous, but because it carried the quiet authority of someone who refused to be anything but decent. In the galley, Amber and Grant stood close, whispering. "What now?" Amber asked. Grant exhaled slowly. "We wait." "For what?" "For the moment to ripen." Amber blinked. "That's poetic." Grant allowed himself a small smile. "So is justice, sometimes." They watched as Victoria tapped her phone again in frustration, then slammed it down on her tray table. She looked around expecting allies, affirmations, maybe even applause. But the eyes that met hers were no longer admiring. They were uncertain. Some were disappointed. Others, quietly furious. Back in seat 1E, Julian felt the shift too. Not in noise, but in energy. The seat under him had once felt like a battleground. Now, it felt like home. He had no interest in humiliating anyone. His goal was never revenge. All he wanted was to sit where he was supposed to sit, without being judged for how he looked, what he wore, or what assumptions someone else had made about his worth. And he had done that without a single insult, without a single raised word. In row 2, a woman named Kareno relation turned to the stranger beside her. "Would you have handled it like that?" she asked. The man shook his head. "Probably not." "I would have gotten mad, loud." She nodded. "Me too." Then they both looked back at Julian. "But maybe that's why we're not CEOs," the man added. They laughed softly, not at him, but at the truth. 20 minutes had passed. The plane had not moved. But everything else had. The cabin's loyalty had shifted. The emotional temperature had dropped. Victoria's fortress of entitlement now felt more like a shrinking island. And Julian? He was still. He had let the world catch up to what he already knew, that power isn't always loud, that leadership isn't always visible, and that the quietest stance can make the deepest impact. Back at Vanguard's corporate headquarters, Logan Pierce, Vice President of Risk Operations, reviewed the live feed from Protocol Raven. He watched as sensors lit up with minor slowdowns across the airline systems. Nothing dangerous, but noticeable. Enough to send signals both internally and externally that something important was happening. Logan didn't need the full story. He didn't need to know every detail. If Julian had activated the protocol, then it meant the moment mattered, and the message would ripple far beyond the cabin. Inside the plane, Captain Morgan Tate stepped out of the cockpit and into the cabin. It was rare. Pilots didn't leave the flight deck once passengers were boarded, especially not before takeoff. But this wasn't a routine flight anymore. He walked to the front, stood quietly near Grant and Amber, and took in the scene. Victoria saw him and immediately leaned forward. Finally, someone who can do something. Captain Tate said nothing at first. His eyes moved from Victoria to Julian. And then, with a soft nod, he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We've been made aware of a situation regarding seating assignments. We're conducting a review and will provide updates shortly." He didn't name names. He didn't take sides. But the weight of his presence said what needed saying. This was bigger than a seat. This was about how people behave when they think they won't be held accountable. Julian remained still. Even as Victoria fidgeted beside him, even as whispers turned to conclusions, even as her control crumbled, he never gloated. He didn't smirk. He didn't say, "I told you so." He just waited, like a stone in a rushing river. Because some men don't fight for power, they stand for principle. And when they do, the world has no choice but to notice. For 23 minutes, time moved differently in first class. Passengers who were once flipping through magazines or sipping complimentary wine had now grown still. Their curiosity pulled toward the silent standoff in row 1. No yelling. No fight, just one man standing calmly beside his assigned seat, and one woman clutching two of them like a throne she was born to inherit. The tension, like the stale recycled air, was thick enough to taste. Victoria Hensley, wrapped tightly in her lavender blanket, adjusted her sunglasses even though they weren't needed indoors. Her jaw clenched tighter with every passing second. Julian Carter hadn't said another word. And yet, he had said everything. Passengers whispered more openly now. He didn't even raise his voice. Did you see how she talked to him? This is embarrassing. But then came a sentence that stopped conversations mid-breath. Wait, isn't that Julian Carter? It was spoken softly by a woman in 2F, scrolling through offline screenshots on her phone. Her husband turned to look. You mean the CEO? He asked. Yeah, she replied. Julian Carter. He's the head of Vanguard Aero. Across the aisle, a businessman in his 60s perked up. Are you sure? The woman nodded slowly. Saw him in a Forbes article last year. Same suit, same calm face. And just like that, the mood inside the cabin began to tilt. Not all at once, not in gasps or shouts, but like the quiet shift of a tide pulling away from the shore. People turned their heads. They looked again at the man in the navy suit, not as someone who might belong, but someone who absolutely did. Victoria's fingers moved quickly on her phone, but still, no signal. Frustration colored her expression as she turned to Amber, the young flight attendant. I need the Wi-Fi. I need to send an urgent email. Amber kept her voice calm, but her stance was different now, firmer. I'm sorry, ma'am. The network is currently under technical review. Julian's phone, tucked neatly in his jacket, vibrated softly. Another message. Passenger manifest flagged. Cabin ID matches. Protocol Raven confirmed. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. The plan was already in motion. Victoria, feeling the atmosphere shifting, sat up straighter. Why is everyone looking over here? No one answered, or rather everyone did. With their silence, Grant Harrison, the purser, approached Julian discreetly. He'd been briefed earlier that someone from executive relations was flying incognito, but had no idea who. Now the picture was clear. Sir, he said softly, is there anything you'd like us to do? Julian looked up at him with the same gentle gravity he'd maintained since boarding. No, thank you, he replied. Let it unfold. People are watching for the right reasons. Grant gave a small nod and stepped back. It wasn't often that lessons unfolded in real time, in real space. But this wasn't a policy training video. This was real, and it was happening at 30,000 feet. At the rear of first class, conversations began to evolve. He didn't even say who he was. He didn't have to. That's the guy who made Vanguard #1 in ethics last year, right? Yeah, he's known for flying commercial and sitting with regular passengers. A mother in row 3 leaned over to her son. You know how we talk about doing the right thing, even when no one's watching? The boy nodded. Well, that's what that man's doing. Meanwhile, Victoria was becoming visibly uncomfortable. The blanket that once made her feel powerful now felt like a costume. She tugged at it, tried to reclaim her posture, but the energy had changed. Entitlement had met consequence, and consequence had a name. Julian Carter. She leaned toward Amber again. Is this going to delay the flight much longer? Amber kept her tone neutral. We're waiting for ground confirmation, ma'am. Victoria clenched her teeth. All this for a seat? But everyone knew it wasn't just a seat. Back in the operations center, Logan Pierce watched as systems adjusted flight delay markers. He didn't touch anything. He didn't need to. The signal had been sent. The CEO was in the air, and something was being tested, not the software, but the culture. And everyone, employees, executives, crew, was now part of that test. Back in the cabin, Captain Morgan Tate re-emerged from the cockpit. His appearance wasn't routine, it was intentional. He stood at the front of the cabin, eyes calmly scanning the passengers. Then he addressed the crew in a low voice. "Full crew reset. Execute quietly." Grant nodded. Amber's eyes widened slightly. She understood. This was bigger than protocol. This was about principle. A few minutes later, a soft chime rang out. Then over the intercom, "Ladies and gentlemen, due to an ongoing internal seating review, the current flight crew will momentarily disembark. We ask for your continued patience." A hush fell across the cabin. Passengers exchanged confused looks. Victoria jolted upright. "What does that mean? You can't just leave. This is absurd." But the cabin wasn't looking at her anymore. All eyes had returned to Julian, and now many nodded. A few clapped quietly. It wasn't for drama. It was for dignity. Victoria turned to Julian one last time. "This is because of you," she spat. Julian turned his head, not in anger but in truth. "No," he said gently. "This is because of what you assumed I wasn't. Some revolutions begin with a bang, others with a whisper, and some, like the one unfolding on Flight 3921, begin with a single tap on a phone." Julian Carter had made no announcements, no declarations. He hadn't mentioned his position or demanded authority. But when he pressed Activate Protocol Raven, the machinery of a much larger system began to turn, not with noise, but with precision. Far from the plane, at a secure Vanguard Aero Operations Hub outside Atlanta, a notification slid across a supervisor's dashboard. "Protocol Raven, live executive presence confirmed, passive disruption underway." The young engineer monitoring the board didn't panic. He didn't even flinch. He simply straightened in his chair and clicked Acknowledge. He'd heard of this protocol, most had. It wasn't for emergencies like engine failures or cybersecurity breaches. It was reserved for something far rarer, a values breach, a dignity failure, when someone in power needed to quietly but decisively remind the system who it serves. Back on board, passengers were starting to feel it. At first, it was the Wi-Fi. 1 minute it was spotty, the next completely gone. Victoria Hensley clicked her phone again, tapping the screen like sheer willpower would bring back the signal. Nothing. She muttered, "Unbelievable. How can an airline not have working internet in first class?" Amber passed by, calm but firm. "We're experiencing some temporary service disruption, ma'am. We apologize for the inconvenience." Victoria wasn't used to apologies that didn't come with immediate solutions, especially not from staff she believed were beneath her. She leaned out into the aisle. "Get me someone from the flight deck." Now. But Grant Harrison was already stepping in. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. We are in restricted movement protocol until further notice." His tone was level, but unmistakably final. Victoria's eyes widened. She knew when tone had shifted from deference to distance. It rattled her more than she let show. Julian remained still, hands folded neatly in his lap. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't even look satisfied. He looked resolved. Because this wasn't about proving a point to a single woman. It was about proving a standard to everyone watching. That even in silence, dignity matters. That quiet people are not weak people. And that arrogance, dressed as confidence, eventually folds in on itself. From rows behind, whispers turned to conversation. "Have you ever heard of a CEO doing this before? Not like this. Most would have just pulled rank." But he didn't. He just waited. That's real power. Someone in row 5 was discreetly recording. Not for likes, not for drama. But because they knew this was something worth remembering, worth sharing, not a fight. Not a scandal, a stand. Meanwhile, in Vanguard's West Coast Ops Center, flight departure boards began showing subtle delays. LAX, JFK, DFW. Or the small markers, slight pushes. Technicians knew something was happening, but only a select few understood why. Logan Pierce did. He was in a glass-walled office reviewing real-time metrics when he saw the pattern. He smiled, not because things were going wrong, but because something was going right. He picked up the phone. "Hayes just went live," he said to the internal director. A pause. "Protocol Raven?" the voice asked. "Confirmed. No need to interfere. Let it breathe." Back on the plane, Victoria was spiraling. Every tactic she'd used before, arrogance, escalation, entitlement, was collapsing. She stood up suddenly. "I want off this flight. I am not sitting here and being treated like this." Passengers around her stiffened. Some turned away. Others didn't bother hiding their reactions anymore. Amber didn't flinch. "Ma'am, I need you to remain seated until the captain instructs otherwise." "I want your name," Victoria snapped. "My name is Amber, ma'am," she said, unfazed. "And I stand by our crew's actions." Julian tilted his head slightly toward the window. His reflection stared back, not angry, not smug, just watching. As the world finally saw what he'd known all along, that sometimes, to fix a broken culture, you don't need outrage. You just need to interrupt its rhythm. Outside the plane, something unusual was happening. Ground crew weren't dispatching as quickly. Some luggage carts had been paused. Jet bridges remained connected longer than usual. Not chaos, but controlled friction. Every small delay was a whisper. "Pay attention. Something is off." And slowly, it reached the right people. In the cabin, the murmurs reached a swell. A man in 2A said, "This isn't about one woman anymore. This is about who we let win when no one pushes back." A woman in 3F replied, "She thought she could treat him like he was less. She didn't know who he was." "But that's the point, isn't it?" her husband added. "She never should have had to know who he was." To treat him with basic respect. Victoria sat back down, defeated but trying not to show it. Her eyes were glassy now, not with remorse, but with the realization that power had shifted and she didn't hold the reins. She tugged her blanket closer, but it no longer looked regal. It looked small. Julian Carter said nothing, because he'd said enough. With his presence, with his patience, with his refusal to move, even 1 inch, from principle. Victoria Hensley had always been the kind of woman who walked into a room and expected it to bend around her. And for most of her life, it had. Hotels had upgraded her before she even asked. Waiters had memorized her usual. Airlines had nodded and smiled whether she deserved it or not. But now, sitting stiffly in seat 1F with her blanket clutched like armor, nothing was bending, not the flight crew, not the systems, and definitely not the man in one of Julian Carter, whose silent presence was unraveling the carefully built scaffolding of her privilege. And the worst part, the cabin knew. The realization of Julian's identity had changed the temperature of the flight, not because people suddenly respected him more, but because they saw her for who she really was. A woman so sure of her status that she believed others didn't deserve to sit beside her. A woman who had picked the wrong man to underestimate. She tried to recover her posture, crossed her legs, fixed her hair, pulled her phone out once again. Still no service, still no Wi-Fi, still no support. Her fingers hovered, as if about to call anyone, but the silence of her useless device felt louder than ever. The man beside her hadn't spoken in over 20 minutes, hadn't looked at her, hadn't reacted to her presence. And yet he was winning. In row 2, a teenage girl looked toward the front. "Mom," she whispered, "why is everyone staring at that woman?" Her mother leaned in. "Because she was rude to the wrong person." "Is she in trouble?" "Not yet, but she should be." The girl paused. "What did the man do?" Her mother smiled gently. "He stayed calm. That's what made the difference." Across the aisle, a man in a dark green sweater pulled his phone out of airplane mode just to check nothing. No Wi-Fi, he muttered, and I'm kinda glad. His seatmate raised an eyebrow. Why? Because for once people are actually watching. Really watching. No hashtags, no filters. Just watching who we are when we think no one's keeping score. At the front of the plane, Grant Harrison stood near the galley, speaking in hushed tones with Captain Morgan Tate. The energy's changed, Grant said. Morgan nodded. The moment's matured. Time to act. Are we grounding? Not yet, Morgan replied. We're giving the cabin a chance to self-correct. Grant raised an eyebrow. Like, humanity check? Morgan smiled faintly. Exactly. The curtain between business class and first swished as Logan Pierce, Vanguard Aero's VP of Corporate Risk, stepped into view. He didn't wear a uniform. No name tag, but he had presence and passengers sensed it. Logan walked with calm precision straight to the crew station. He spoke briefly to Grant, then turned toward Victoria's seat. Ma'am, he said in a clear but respectful tone, please return to your assigned seat and remain seated. Victoria looked up, incredulous. Who are you? Logan Pierce. Vanguard Aero Corporate Risk Division. You work for the airline. I work for the people the airline is supposed to serve, he said evenly, which includes every passenger on this flight. Julian finally looked up, just for a moment. Their eyes met. Logan gave a small nod. Julian gave nothing back, just a steady look, as if to say, let it unfold. I'm only here to witness. Victoria's face shifted. The mask of indifference cracked. Are you seriously telling me to move? She asked. No, Logan replied. I'm telling you that you've already lost the room. This isn't about a seat anymore. He gestured around. You lost the respect of the cabin, of the crew, and of the people who once would have said nothing. You lost it because you assumed your comfort mattered more than someone else's dignity. Victoria blinked, stunned, and then she sat back. No protest, no sarcasm, just a quiet surrender that felt heavier than any argument. Julian turned his gaze back to the window, still silent, still centered. The woman beside him had tried everything, condescension, defiance, escalation, manipulation, and none of it moved him, because that's what power looks like when it isn't hungry to be seen. Amber, watching from the galley, exhaled slowly. That man didn't just change this flight, she whispered to Grant. He changed me. Grant looked at her, surprised. How so? I used to believe you had to yell to get justice, that you had to push back loud. But now I see sometimes you just have to stand your ground and let the world see who really breaks first, the cabin exhaled. Not all at once, but in a quiet, collective release, as if the plane itself understood the weight that had just been lifted. A murmur of agreement moved down the rows. Subtle, no clapping, no chants. Just nods, and the silent recognition of a line redrawn. In seat 2B, a woman tapped her offline notes app and typed, "Dignity doesn't raise its voice. It just waits until arrogance runs out of air." Victoria adjusted her seat, her movements robotic. No eye contact. No more words. She was no longer the center of the flight. She was just a passenger now, like everyone else. And that, perhaps, was the greatest shift of all. Julian Carter sat back in seat 1, the seat he had never truly left. Around him, the cabin had shifted from icy tension to quiet reflection. And though no formal announcement had been made, every passenger on board Flight 3921 understood what had just occurred. A line had been drawn, a balance had been reset, and Julian had done it without uttering more than a few sentences. Victoria Hensley, who had earlier lounged across both first-class seats as if she owned them, now sat upright in 1F. No longer draped in entitlement, her posture was taut, her lips pursed, her blanket now folded tightly in her lap like a schoolchild's sweater after a scolding. No one had yelled at her. No one had pushed her. She had simply been seen. By the passengers, by the crew, by herself. That was the worst of it. Julian didn't glance her way. His eyes remained fixed forward, as if the view ahead deserved more of his attention than the disruption behind. He wasn't vindictive, he wasn't smug, he was finished. Because the point had been made. The seat he reclaimed wasn't just a chair, it was a symbol of patience, dignity, and the kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself. A woman in row 3 leaned toward her husband. "I've never seen anything like that," she whispered. He nodded. "It's strange. I feel prouder to be on this flight now." Amber passed through the cabin again, now walking taller. She didn't say anything to Julian, but as she walked by, she slowed for just a moment. Their eyes met briefly. She gave a small, respectful nod. Julian returned it, just barely. In that shared look was a world of gratitude. Not just for him, but for the lesson. That sometimes the most powerful protest is no protest at all. Back in the operations center, data rolled in across the screens. Social media hashtags were popping up across platforms, despite the flight still being in the air. Flight 3921, #Dignity Sky, the man in 1E. Tweets from other airports, reposted screenshots, even speculation from news outlets had started surfacing. The disruption protocol had created ripples far beyond the aircraft itself. And it wasn't just gossip. People were asking questions about respect, about corporate values, about what kind of culture Vanguard Aero was cultivating and defending. In the cabin, someone clapped. It was soft, almost unsure, but then another joined, and another. Not an ovation, not a celebration, just acknowledgement. Julian didn't turn toward the sound. He didn't need it. This moment had never been about him. At the front of the plane, Logan Pierce, the VP, who had entered without fanfare, watched silently as the claps spread. He'd seen a lot in his time with the company. Disputes, delays, even emergencies, but this was something different. Because it wasn't about logistics or service or refunds. It was about what happens when a quiet man refuses to be dismissed. Victoria sank lower in her seat. She could feel the weight of every pair of eyes not looking at her, but knowing. The kind of knowing that doesn't shout. It just lingers. And she knew deep down that this moment would follow her far longer than any 5-hour flight. Julian pulled out his tablet. It buzzed softly in his hands. A secure message appeared on the screen. System Ripple confirmed. Cabin authority recalibrated. Protocol Raven. De-escalation initiated. He tapped once to acknowledge, then set the tablet aside. His job here wasn't over, but his role in this moment was... He hadn't come to prove a point. He hadn't come to teach a lesson. He'd come to fly. The world had simply given him something else to carry first. In row 2, a man whispered to his wife, "You think he planned all that?" She shook her head. "No. I think he just refused to leave when someone tried to erase him." Victoria tried one last move. She pulled out her phone, now with a flicker of service, and began composing an email. Her lips moved as she mouthed the words, "Unlawful seating change. Legal action pending." But something in her hands shook, and when she glanced around, there was no one left to impress. No allies. No eyes in support, just a cabin full of people who had already made up their minds. Amber returned once more, this time with a refreshed towel and water for Julian. "Would you care for anything else, Mr. Carter?" she asked quietly. He looked at her, voice calm. "No, thank you, Amber. I'm exactly where I need to be." The cabin door finally sealed. The engines roared softly. Flight 3921 began to taxi, but everyone knew the flight had already taken off long before the wheels left the ground. As Flight 3921 finally ascended into the sky, something far greater than the aircraft began to rise with it. A movement, an awakening. A quiet revolution sparked not by anger, not by protest signs, but by one man in a navy suit who had refused to be moved literally or morally. And now the world was watching. Inside the cabin, the passengers settled into a new kind of stillness. There was no more arguing. No more sideways glances. Even Victoria Hensley, once the self-appointed queen of first class, had gone quiet. She sat with her arms folded, eyes fixed on nothing, while Julian Carter stared out the window at the clouds. He looked peaceful, not because he'd won something, but because something wrong had finally been seen. In row 3, a college student named Lila reopened her notes app and began typing what she'd witnessed. She didn't know Julian's full story yet, but she knew what it had meant to watch him hold his ground with grace. "I saw something powerful today," she wrote. "A woman tried to erase a man with entitlement." He answered with silence. And somehow, that silence spoke louder than any voice I've ever heard. She hit save and posted a snippet of the moment on her Instagram story. The caption read, "The man in seat 1E just changed the way I think about strength." Within minutes, it began to spread. On the ground, in coffee shops and offices, phones started buzzing. Someone at JFK reposted a video clip under the tag #Flight3921. Another user tweeted, "She tried to claim both seats. He quietly showed her she didn't own the plane of the world." The quote was paired with a blurry photo of Julian seated, composed, as Victoria looked away in shame. It was reshared over 40,000 times in 3 hours. In Vanguard Aero's social listening command center, alerts began spiking. "Sir," an analyst called out, "engagement on our brand just tripled. We're trending in 6 states. Logan Pierce, monitoring from his tablet, just nodded. "Let it build," he said. "Should we respond?" "Not yet. Let the people tell the story first." In a downtown Chicago newsroom, an editor looked up from her monitor. "Have you seen this seat dispute on Flight 3921? The guy who stayed calm? Apparently, he's the CEO." A younger reporter leaned in. "Wait, Julian Carter? Yeah, he never said who he was, just sat still." "Write it up," the editor said. Headline: "The man who didn't move. CEO turns one flight into a lesson on dignity." Back on the plane, Julian opened his tablet. The screen flickered gently. A map showed major airport delays, small but intentional. Nothing unsafe, nothing that would endanger passengers, but enough to create friction. Enough to get people to notice. A small pop-up appeared in the corner of the screen. Flight 3921 trending. Public sentiment. 92% positive. Initiate post-flight policy protocol. YN. Julian paused, then tapped Y. He closed the tablet and returned to the window. A few rows back, an elderly man with a deep southern accent leaned across the aisle to speak to a younger woman. "You know, my father marched in Selma," he said quietly. "I always thought courage had to be loud, had to shake the streets." The woman nodded, listening. "But now I wonder if there's something braver," he continued. "Like sitting still while someone tries to erase your worth, and letting the world decide who really matters." The woman smiled, her eyes misty. "Today, the world chose well." Meanwhile, Victoria had pulled out a legal pad from her tote. She scribbled notes furiously. Violation of comfort, public embarrassment, possible defamation. But the rhythm of her pen slowed, because every time she looked up, she saw the back of Julian's head. Unbothered. Unshaken. Unmoved. No legal strategy could erase the truth. That her power in this cabin had died the moment people stopped nodding and started noticing. On the other side of the country, in a high-rise boardroom in San Francisco, a group of executives sat around a table watching a replay. A grainy video from the flight showed Julian raising his boarding pass, stating his seat, then saying simply, "I intend to sit here." Nothing else. The silence that followed hit harder than any speech. "Who is he?" one executive asked. Another replied, "He's the kind of leader we say we want, but rarely get." On board, Amber made another pass with service carts. She offered Julian water. He accepted with a nod. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "thank you for what you did." Julian met her gaze, then shook his head gently. "I didn't do anything special," he replied. "I just didn't move." The plane cut through the clouds now, sunlight streaming through the windows. Some passengers typed out reflections, others just sat in thought. No one was arguing. No one was posturing, they were simply thinking about what they had seen and who they wanted to be after seeing it. Julian glanced down at his folded boarding pass, now creased from his grip. To anyone else, it was just a slip of paper. But to him, it was something more. A reminder that sometimes the seat you hold isn't given by status but by how you carry yourself once someone tries to take it away. By the time Flight 3921 touched down, something had already shifted, more than just altitude. The wheels kissed the runway with quiet finality, but for the passengers on board, the real landing had happened hours earlier. Not on the tarmac, but in their minds. They had witnessed something unusual in today's world. A man who didn't shout, didn't posture, didn't retaliate. He simply refused to give up his seat, because giving up his seat would have meant giving up his dignity. And now, that moment was spreading across the country like sunrise. In the following days, social media flooded with reflections. The man in 1E didn't raise his voice, he raised the standard. She threw a blanket over 2 seats. He threw a blanket over a broken system. Julian Carter didn't move, and because of that, the airline industry finally did. Hashtags like #DignitySky and #TheManIn1E trended for 72 hours. But what mattered most wasn't the virality, it was the conversation. In corporate boardrooms across America, something rare happened. Executives paused their product launches and marketing decks to ask, are we treating our customers with respect to just managing them? At Vanguard Aero headquarters, it wasn't just a PR opportunity. It was a turning point. Because Julian Carter had never intended to be a symbol, but that seater had become one. Not just of passenger rights, but of what respect looks like in public spaces. Within 1 week, Vanguard Aero made sweeping announcements. Dignity scorecards would be introduced. Passengers and crew could anonymously rate in-flight interactions for fairness and professionalism. Internal bias. Training for all flight crews mandatory, not optional, not performative. Rapid response culture. Team a new division designed to assess dignity violations before they spiral. And most powerful of all, a pledge printed clearly on every boarding pass. Your seat is your right. Your voice is welcome. Your dignity is non-negotiable. The industry watched, some mocked, others followed. Because they knew Julian Carter doesn't make noise, he makes change. News anchors called it the seat heard around the world. Talk shows debated, should every airline follow suit? Former flight attendants wrote op-eds, we've seen passengers mistreated for less. It's time we protect more than just safety, we protect humanity. Even comedians joined in, some joking, others admitting, that guy showed more backbone sitting still than most of us do yelling online. Meanwhile, Victoria Hensley? Her version of the story didn't land. She'd tried reaching out to law firms. Some refused, others quietly withdrew. Her complaint never gained traction. Because the videos told a different story. Because the cabin, the crew, and the cameras had captured more than just a seat dispute, they had captured an undoing. Her name faded as quickly as the hashtags rose. But the lesson remained. Privilege may speak first, but truth speaks last. At home, Julian declined all interview requests. No comment, his assistant said each time. He has no interest in becoming the story. He didn't need a book deal, or a podcast appearance, or a feature spread. He had his seat, he had his voice. and he had made sure no one would forget how it felt to have those things stripped away, even for a moment. At Vanguard Aero's annual leadership summit, employees expected business as usual. Spreadsheets, projections, forecasts. Instead, Julian stood on stage holding a simple object in his hand, a crumpled boarding pass. He didn't use slides. He didn't clear his throat. He simply said, "This piece of paper gave me a seat. But it was the way I held it that gave it meaning." He paused. "This isn't about me. It never was. It's about what happens when we treat people like their worth comes from status, and what changes when we stop." No applause, just silence. And then, a standing ovation, not out of obligation, out of understanding. Amber, the flight attendant from 3921, was promoted. Not because of the incident, but because of how she had handled it with grace under pressure, and a quiet evolution that leadership couldn't ignore. Grant Harrison, the purser, now led Vanguard's new training division. His first seminar? Holding space, the power of presence in conflict. He didn't quote policy. He quoted Julian. "Let it unfold." People are watching for the right reasons. Outside the airline industry, schools began using the story of Flight 3921 in ethics classes. Not to talk about aviation, but to talk about courage, composure, character. And across America, people began to rethink what it means to take a stand. Because sometimes a stand doesn't look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like sitting still and refusing to be moved. On a cool spring evening, Julian walked alone through an airport terminal. No entourage. No cameras, no recognition. He carried only a small duffel bag and a worn boarding pass tucked in his pocket. Gate B22. He scanned his pass, nodded at the attendant, and made his way toward the jet bridge. Coach class this time, not because he had to. Because he chose to. He believed leadership shouldn't ride on legroom, it should ride on principle. And as he found his seat he smiled. Not because it was comfortable, but because it was his. And no one knew misunderstanding, no blanket, no entitlement would ever take that from him again. Months had passed since Flight 3921 landed, but the story hadn't faded. If anything, it had deepened, become something more than just a viral moment or a headline. It had rooted itself quietly into how people thought about travel, power, and how we treat one another in the spaces we share. Not because of outrage, not because of spectacle, but because of a man who chose to hold his ground without ever raising his voice. And that choice, that stillness, continued to echo long after the wheels touched down. Julian Carter had returned to his life. No press tours, no keynote speeches, no awards acceptance circuits. He didn't want to become a figurehead. He wanted to remain a reminder that change didn't always come from the top down. Sometimes it came from one seat, one decision, one moment when a person refuses to be made small. At Vanguard Aero, the impact became institutional. Every new crew member now took a course titled Dignity in the Air, the human side of service. Every flight lead now carried a digital dashboard that allowed them to monitor dignity scorecards in real time, just as they would turbulence or fuel levels. And every crew member knew the name, Julian Carter, not because he demanded respect, but because he taught them how to protect it. On the anniversary of the flight, the company quietly renamed a training center, the Carter Room, a space for quiet leadership. Inside the room was no statue, no photo wall. Just one thing, displayed behind glass, a faded boarding pass marked 1E. Outside the airline, the story had settled into American culture as something rare, a modern fable, but real, a parable without preaching, a story passed down not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. In classrooms, teachers used it to talk about values. "Let's talk about what Julian Carter did," they'd say. "He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He waited. He let the world see what happens when someone carries themselves with dignity and refuses to let it go. Kids listened. Because for once, the hero didn't wear a cape. He wore a boarding pass and a calm expression. In churches, the story became a sermon. Not about revenge, but about resolve. Not about proving your worth, but knowing it. Ministers spoke of the man who turned a seat into a stand, and congregants nodded, not with awe but with understanding. Even in politics, usually loud, divisive, Julian's story was cited quietly in a bipartisan bill promoting passenger rights and dignity protections across federal transportation services. No one objected, because no one could. There was no argument against the idea that people deserve to be treated like people. Julian never commented. He didn't need to. His silence had already said everything. And besides, he wasn't finished listening. One evening, Julian visited a small regional airport in the Midwest, where Vanguard had just opened a new terminal. He wasn't there to speak. He was there to fly. As he waited at the gate, a little boy with wide eyes walked over, holding his mother's hand. "Are you the man from the airplane?" the boy asked shyly. Julian smiled. "I was on a flight, yes." The boy looked up. "My teacher said you changed the rules." Julian knelt to the boy's level. "I didn't change the rules," he said gently. "I just reminded people how we should treat each other." The boy nodded, like he understood more than anyone expected. His mother whispered, "Thank you for what you did." Julian stood. "We all have a seat in this world. We just have to protect it sometimes." Later, as he boarded the plane, Julian passed row 1. Seat 1E was empty. He didn't sit there. He kept walking all the way to the back until he reached his assigned seat 28A, a window seat again. He smiled as he sat. The sun was setting outside, casting soft golden light across the cabin, and for a brief moment, everything felt still like it had that day in the air, when the world paused to listen to a man who refused to be moved. As the plane climbed into the sky, Julian looked out the window, one hand resting gently on the boarding pass in his jacket pocket. Not the one from today, the one from then. The one that reminded him, and anyone who asked that dignity, doesn't demand the spotlight. It holds its ground quietly, until the world has no choice but to follow. In a world that often rewards the loudest voice, Julian Carter's quiet stand reminds us that dignity doesn't need volume to be powerful. He didn't raise his voice, didn't throw accusations, and didn't demand respect. He simply held his ground when someone tried to take it from him. That moment, witnessed by a plane full of strangers and eventually by millions online, teaches us that true strength lies not in dominance, but in restraint. For older Americans, many of whom have weathered injustice, been overlooked, or had to fight silently for their place in society, this story reaffirms a timeless truth. Your worth is not determined by how loudly you speak, but by how deeply you stand in who you are. Whether in a boardroom, a doctor's office, or a family gathering, there is quiet power in calm conviction. We may not all be CEOs, but we all sit somewhere in life, in society, in our families, and we all deserve that seat. Julian didn't just keep his chair on that flight. He reminded us all that respect is not a privilege, it's a right.